It is now 1:30, which means we can kick off. And let's start with my all favorite modern parallels. And the question that I'd like to ask, really, of course, we're asking the question, what was the Reformation? But the question I'd like to ask is, how different are we to the past, and what makes us different to people in the past? Obviously, technology. That's the main clear difference, right? And it's hard to divorce that from the culture and the society that people used to have. But when I think about the main difference that how different we as a society are to people 500 years ago, the main difference has to be religion. To people 500 years ago, religion was really, really important. And not to say it's not important in some ways, and to a lot of people now, Western Europe and the West in general is quite secular. And a lot of countries are not very secular. But what's certainly true is that no country would invade another country with the stated reason for that invasion being they are a different religion to us, right? That's not, even if that was ever the reason why they actually invaded, that's no longer the fig leaf. That's no longer the justification that people give to why they fight wars. That's the level of importance it used to be. So when we begin to think about the Reformation, and we're going to, if you haven't even heard of it at all, don't worry, there'll be context, there'll be background info. But when we think about these religious struggles that people had, it's important to remember just how important religion was, not just to high level geopolitics, but to the lives of average, everyday people. Religion would in many ways dominate your social, cultural, and spiritual life. So bear that in mind as we move forwards. And today we are going to do a story of 3 acts. The first act will be, why did the Reformation happen? What were the trends and triggers and things that led up to it? Second will be, how did the Reformation happen? What were the actual mechanics and the people that fought against it and for it and that kind of thing? And then finally, we're going to think about what the effects of the Reformation were, and on Europe, on Christianity, on people. Let's see. And then we can make some crazy modern parallels and talk about the modern world and all that kind of fun stuff. So, before we can begin to think about the Reformation, let's think about Europe in the 16th century. Say the year 1500 is where we can start. And we have a nice map here. And from one point of view alone, what you can see is that a lot of Europe is dominated by these massive polities. So the Ottoman Empire rules all of the Balkans and Greece. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Muscovy rules almost all of Eastern Europe, and France and the areas of Spain and England. These are large places. But in Central Europe, and to a lesser extent Eastern Europe, there is this whole mess of small states that together comprise the Holy Roman Empire, that you may remember from about a month ago when we talked about the Holy Roman Empire and its 6 weeks even, and its constituent parts and the nation it was, such as you can call it. But it's been about 150 years since the last talk. So let's catch ourselves up a little bit with what's happened in Europe since then. So let's think about, for example, technology, because in many ways, technology spurs on the rest of society and culture, as I said. There have been developments like in military ways. The rifle has been invented, a very accurate kind of gunpowder weapon. Eyeglasses have been invented, which I'm very grateful for, because I'd have a very hard time surviving in modern society. I'm very short-sighted. Buttons have been invented, right? People can now dress themselves more. That was in the 14th century for the first time. But the most important one, I would claim, is the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century. Movable type, and the idea that you can get some written information, reproduce it, make hundreds and thousands of copies of it, and then send them out across any space area very, very quickly. Before the printing press, any copied out books were copied out by hand. You'd have to write the book out again, and then you'd have one copy. Printing press makes that orders of magnitude cheaper, faster, easier. So that's the big one. And let's have a think about the social developments since the Middle Ages. By 1500, the population of Europe has recovered from the Black Death. Remember how big a crisis that was, how many people died from that crisis. The population is now back up to where it was before. And in many ways, it's much more urbanized than it was before. So Venice, Milan, Paris, Constantinople, they all have, these are cities of over 100,000 inhabitants. And it's estimated there are maybe 22 cities that had more than 40,000 people. Obviously, from modern eyes, that's quite small, but at the time, that's a significant population. Most of these cities were in Italy or the Iberian Peninsula, but there are also cities like this in France, the Holy Roman Empire, the Low Countries, modern-day Netherlands and Belgium, and also London is the only one in the entirety of the British Isles, I'm afraid. But London was a decent-sized city, as so many others. Also, it's worth mentioning that on average, per European country, there were 2 or 3 universities. England has Oxford and Cambridge. Scotland has 4, I think. Edinburgh, Glasgow, St Andrews, and another one that I can't remember. France has a couple. Spain has a couple. But the Holy Roman Empire has about 12. So the Holy Roman Empire is much more educated, and that's not just on the high level. The literacy rates in the Holy Roman Empire are comparatively quite high. Around 10% of people in rural areas can read and write, and maybe even 25% in the urban areas. So there's a growing social awareness that develops up to what we are now calling the early modern period. We have left the Middle Ages behind. And last of all, to talk briefly of politics. We are living in kind of a 3 superpower Europe. So France, the line of Habsburgs, and the Ottoman Empire are the 3 biggest political powers in Europe. I am sorry to all my British viewers. We are comparatively irrelevant. It kind of sucks. We're a secondary power, certainly. And when I say the Habsburgs, from 1519, I believe it was, possibly earlier than that. No, 1519 was the election. Charles V, one man, rules over the Holy Roman Empire, so that big, massive, spread out, tiny little polities in Central Europe, the Archduchy of Austria to the southeast of Europe, Naples, so southern Italy, Castile and Aragon, so modern-day Spain, and also vast swathes of the New World. So one man controls huge amounts of land in Europe, also the French kings, also the Ottomans. Those are the 3 big power structures of Europe in the 16th century. By 1500, which is roughly where we're talking about here. This talk will kind of cover the first half of the 16th century in very broad terms. There's going to be broad strokes required here. This is a complex topic, and I'm boiling it down to a half-hour talk. So, a little background to the Catholic Church. And if you are either not familiar with Catholicism or not familiar with Christianity or not familiar with religion, again, don't worry, background and context, here we go. How is it organized? Well, step 1 is the lay people, so just every person who is Catholic, and that is almost every person for Central and Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, you have Eastern Orthodoxy. Shout out to any Greek, Russian, Bulgarian, Ukrainian, I don't know, those kind of people. And that's a whole other complex thing that starts in the 4th century AD that I haven't got time to get into. But in the 16th century, almost everyone is Catholic in Western Europe. There are various heresies, and we'll talk about those in a little bit, but you're Catholic. And so for most people, you are just a Catholic person who is lay. One up from that, you have priests and deacons, who are the people that minister to the common folk. And then above them, you have bishops, archbishops, cardinals, and finally the Pope. But the archbishops and cardinals and popes, they are all technically just kinds of bishops, just of various powers. But that's the kind of hierarchy, the structure of the church. And you have power of the people below you. Although it's important to note that the most powerful body in the Catholic Church in this time isn't the Pope themselves, who we now think of as the leader, but is actually a general church council. So when all the cardinals and important bishops get together and make decisions, those decisions are the ones that stick, not just whatever the Pope says. And it is the Pope's duty, whenever there is a new Pope, to call a general church council to deal with administrative matters and to pass legislation. But you might have thought, hang on a second, there's a contradiction here, because if the Pope calls a general church council, they're creating a body that has power over them. So surely the Pope just wouldn't call a general church council, right? Why would you make something more powerful than you? Well, they didn't for a long period of time. There hadn't been a general church council for ages. And there will be one in this narrative. And after it, there won't be one for ages. General church councils are rare because the Pope is technically only ever primus inter patriae, which means first among equals, first among brothers. and doesn't really have necessarily that amount of authority over everyone else in the form of a general church council. The rest of the time, they can basically run the show, and they do. So that's kind of how it's organized. And we'll talk a bit about what's important to the Catholic Church in a second, but let's just think about popes and the leaders in this time, because the leaders of the papacy are, the word used to describe them as worldly. So that means they aren't just worried about spiritual, theological things. They're worried about the world. So, for example, you have Pope Julius II, who goes into battle in golden armor and fights wars, expanding territory that he rules back then. So now we have the Vatican City, which is this tiny little piece of land. But in this period, the Papal States was this part of central Italy ruled directly by the Pope. And there were popes who fought wars to expand that territory. So that's one side, that way that popes can be worldly. On the other hand, you have people like Alexander VI, who was a Borgia. If you know anything about medieval Italian life, then you would know that the Borgias are this incredibly influential, very corrupt, very powerful family. And they got one of their people to be Pope. And he openly acknowledged that he had a variety of illegitimate children. He was alleged to have murdered people while in office. He took part in slavery. There was mass corruption and nepotism. He was particularly bad, but definitely not particularly different from the other popes. There was a variety of simony, is what it's called, of corruption and nepotism and criminality that was evident amongst the popes at this point. Due to the way that they were organized and elected into their position, bribery was very commonplace. And the fact that you gained so much wealth when you were pope, people really, really wanted it. And last of all, let's talk about, in some ways, quality. So you may remember that 150 years ago, the Black Death swept through Europe and killed maybe 70% of all the priests in Europe. That decimated, not just decimated, because decimated means 1 in 10 dead, much, much worse than that. It devastated the population of priests in Europe. And the people who lived in Europe still needed priests to look after them for reasons we'll get into in a second. And that meant that random, possibly even not very educated people were becoming priests. And this had a knock-on effect where up until this period, many priests were barely literate, really didn't understand their doctrines very well, and didn't really care a lot about looking after their people. And that's very important, because for the Catholic Church, the thing that justifies you going to heaven is doing good acts. And there are 7 sacraments, 7 different things that are the kinds of good acts that you can do that will get you into heaven. And they are baptism. So that's when you're born and you're, made a Christian for the first time. Confirmation, when you're old enough to decide, yes, I would like to be Catholic, please. Eucharist, so that's eating the bread and drinking the wine every week at Mass. Penance, that's confessing your sins and repenting for them. Last rites, so before you die, you are shriven and your soul can go to heaven properly. Marriage, being married, and taking holy orders, so joining either like a crusader group or becoming a priest or a monk or that kind of thing. And it's important to note that all 7 of those things require a priest for you to be able to do them. And these are all very important things in your life, right? To be married, you need a priest there to marry you to your wife or husband. So it's important that there's this dependence on the priesthood, and the priesthood is lacking. That's the important background on the Catholic Church here. And instantly, if you're wondering, the church we have on our right here is, I believe, the cathedral in Lincoln, which is in England, and it was built in the medieval period. It's a classic example of Gothic architecture that shows the kind of power and wealth and prestige of the church. It looks very nice. So I just included it. So that's a kind of background to the Catholic Church. There's this dialectic almost of, on the one hand, the church is very influential and wealthy and important in the lives of people living in Europe. But on the other hand, they're very corrupt and very sometimes bad at their jobs and doing a lot of things wrong. So finally, the last piece of background for our puzzle is the Holy Roman Empire, where quite a lot of the action will take place. And you may remember, in fact, we had a whole talk about it about a month ago. Everything's about a month ago, all these talks. And you may remember vaguely that it is an elective empire. So it's very, very decentralized. The people who run their individual little states can basically do what they want, to the extent that in some maps, as the one you saw there, it's not even one bordered thing like France is. It's just a whole bunch of different states that owe some fealty to the emperor. And the emperor is elected. There are varying numbers of electors, and these are just the most powerful princes in the empire. In this point, there are 7, and they elect the emperor. And for about 100 years up to this point, the emperor has been a Habsburg every time, which is the name of the royal family. We have Windsors now ruling Britain. They had Habsburgs at that time. And Charles V is the one who rules the Holy Roman Empire here. And a classic example, there's some foreshadowing here, classic example of an elector is Frederick of Saxony, who was a duke. He founded a university. He pressed on the last emperor, Maximilian I. He really pressed the need for reform of the practices and structures of the Holy Roman Empire. He had a collection of relics. That was another way that you would show your faith. One of the kind of good acts to do is to do your penance and do your praying in front of relics, little pieces of saints and important things in history. Well, he had a collection of 17,443 relics, which included, allegedly, the thumb of St. Anne, a twig from Moses' burning bush, some hay from the Holy Manger, some milk from the Virgin Mary. It's kind of nasty. I'm not sure that I'd want that in my house. But, the people here were very, very devout. And Frederick is a very classic example of a very, very devout person. And a word on from the political side, the demography, the kind of people that lived in the Holy Roman Empire, it's this massively diverse array of people. Basically everyone who lives in Central Europe and some of Eastern too. You have Germans and Austrians and Walloons and Italians and Helvetians and Bohemians, Moravians, Slovaks, Poles, Brandenburgers. There's many, many different kinds of people living here, but they do all tend to be quite devout. And finally, it's important to note, we won't come up too much here because we're mainly focusing on religion, that there is simmering unrest in the peasant classes. There are various rebellions and such, and in 1525, there's going to be a massive peasant revolt that will break out into almost all-out war that we won't have time to talk about, unfortunately, because it's really interesting. But that's a thing that will happen as well. So just when you're thinking about what the people were like, a thing to bear in mind. So let's think about the man Martin Luther. And he was a person who had some opinions about the Catholic Church. Now, having opinions about the Catholic Church, particularly bad ones, isn't very good for your health. There are 2 classic examples of people that came before Martin Luther who spoke out and said the Catholic Church is corrupt, it's doing things wrong. The 2 examples that I will give are John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. Wycliffe was from England. Jan Hus was from Prague, modern-day Czechia. Then it was called Bohemia, I believe. And they railed against the corruptions of the church, and both met rather grisly ends. In fact, Jan Hus, I believe, the church said to him, "Hey, Jan Hus, come to Rome and have a debate with us, and we'll take on what you say, and if you say some good stuff, then we'll implement it. And we promise, don't worry, safe passage, sorry, we won't hurt you." He's like, "Yeah, sounds cool." So he went to Rome, and then they said, "Right, you're a heretic," and they burnt him alive. So it's not very good for you a long life if you criticize the Catholic Church too much. But let's think about this third big figure. Well, not the third, there are many before him. Those are just 2 examples. But the one that's important for our purposes now, Martin Luther. And he was an Augustinian monk. So he was a member of the church from that side. He had a doctorate in theology from the University of Wittenberg. And also he was the priest of Wittenberg. So his father, Dr. Brother Luther. He was a religious figure who lived, surprise, in Saxony under the rule of Frederick, the guy that we were talking about earlier. And the one thing that everyone knows about him, if you know anything about the Protestant Reformation, you may have heard of Martin Luther and the 95 Theses. And the 95 Theses was a piece of paper. Basically, he hammered into the door of the church, his church, he was the priest of that church. There was notice of a debate that was going to happen where he would be debating these points. And these points included, first off, it's really bad, the church is corrupt. And in fact, he said that quite sneakily. For example, he said, if the Pope knew what was being preached in his name, he would rather St. Peter's Basilica be burnt down than built up with the skin, flesh, and bones of his sheep. So basically saying, it's not the Pope's fault. I'm not attacking the Pope here. I'm saying the church is terrible. And if only the Pope knew what was going on, he'd stop it. He was very much trying to argue within the practices and confines of the Catholic Church. He wasn't trying to break out from it. He was saying, look, let's just do something about Catholicism is in trouble. Let's try and fix it. But he also said some other stuff. And the other stuff was at this point quite naughty within the confines of the Catholic Church. For example, saying that, all those 7 sacraments, they're doing good works and that gets you into heaven. Nah, not true. The only thing that matters is faith. Sola fides, faith alone is what gets you into heaven. All you have to do is really, really believe in Christianity, and then you'll go to heaven. Obviously, doing good works is good. As he called it, good fruit comes from a good tree. It's just evidence of the fact that you're a good person. It's much more about what's inside than what's outside. He said, when our Lord and Master Jesus Christ said repent, he willed the entire life of believers to be of one repentance. All you should be doing is really, really wanting to not be sinful. He has some serious issues. He has a book, a kind of autobiography called Table Talk, where it's his discussions with his friends, which I think is a very I can imagine a reality TV show called Table Talk. And it's weird that that's what he called it in the 16th century. He talks about being constantly racked with guilt and that he's not being religious enough, even though he has all these qualifications. He's a doctor of theology, for Christ's sake, literally for Christ's sake, in fact. And yet he still feels like he's not religious enough. This is a guy who has, possibly some psychological issues. But he is saying that, first off, what matters is, so there's 2 parts to it. First off, the Catholic Church's practices are bad. And second off, their beliefs and theories are bad as well. And they're saying you should be doing things like, for example, another thing that the Catholics have been doing for a period of time here, which you may have heard of possibly, is indulgences. So they believed that when you die, you either go to heaven, very good place, hell, very bad place, or purgatory, kind of medium, kind of bad place. Heaven, you're there forever. Hell, you're there forever. But purgatory, if you've done some bad stuff in your life, so you're not perfect, but you're not, awful either, you'll go to purgatory for a period of time. And then after that, you can go to heaven. I've heard purgatory is likened to being chased by bees rather than being, pitchforked by the devil for eternity. It's not pleasant, but it's not the worst thing possible. And the idea that the Catholics had, very smart idea, is if you give some money to the Catholic Church in the form of what's called indulgences, your time in purgatory will be reduced. That sounds pretty good, right? So pretty soon there was a matter of inflation on how long it was estimated. If you take your average person who goes up to priest and says, Father, how long will I be in purgatory before I get to go to heaven? And a few hundred years ago, the priest would have said, 4 years if you're a bit bad, and then afterwards you get to go to heaven. By this point, people are saying hundreds of years. But if you pay some money, you can go to heaven almost straight away. And Martin Luther really, it's one of those practices he really wasn't a fan of, said it was very bad, and says, there's no mention in the Bible of purgatory, so why are we talking about it now? He says you could be, this is kind of content warning for sexual assault here, he says you could be forgiven for violating the Virgin Mary if you give enough money to the church. Obviously, in his mind, not a very good thing. So he nails these 95 theses to the wall of his church. And then without his knowledge and without his asking for it to happen, his students take those theses, reprint them, make hundreds and thousands of copies, and send them out all over Europe. Well, all over Germany at first, and then later they would spread all over Europe and become very, very popular. Martin Luther would be, after the Bible, the best-selling author in Europe, as a way to show how popular this guy would become, and the power of the printing press here. So these ideas very quickly begin to spread throughout Europe. And there have been people who have, even in much more mild terms than Wycliffe and Huss, been rethinking Christianity and the way that the Catholic Church operates. This movement called humanism, which you probably have heard of, starts around this period, a bit beforehand. And Erasmus was the most famous member of the humanist movement. And it's the idea that we just think again about all the things in life and reassess them and reevaluate them in very, very broad, basic terms. And he was feeding into that tradition of let's just rethink everything that's been going on for hundreds of years and actually think, is this good? Should we be doing this? And in doing this, Martin Luther drops a bomb on Europe. And I've just looked at the time and realized that we haven't got very much time at all. So we're gonna speed through the last bits of this. Once that happens, a crisis begins spreading across Europe. And first off, the Pope writes a bull. That's a papal bull, is like a letter to Europe. And the first one is called the Exsurgia Domine, where he calls him Brother Martin, and it's very nice and patronizing to Martin Luther, and it says, recant what you say. We don't want to do this. I don't want to excommunicate you. Let's just, if you say I didn't mean it, then we can be cool. Martin Luther publicly burned his copy of the papal bull. Then there was a second papal bull called the Decet Romanum Pontificum, which includes this passage. Nevertheless, Martin himself, and it gives us grievous sorrow and perplexity to say this, the slave of a depraved mind, has scorned to revoke his errors within the prescribed interval and to send us word of such revocation, or to come to us himself. You can guess why he didn't want to come to them himself. Nay, like a stone of stumbling, he has feared not to write and preach worse things than before against us, and this holy see, and the Catholic faith, and to lead others on to do the same. He has now been declared a heretic, and so also others, whatever their authority and rank, who have cared naught of their own salvation, but publicly and in all men's eyes become followers of Martin's pernicious and heretical sect, and given him openly and publicly their help, counsel, and favour, encouraging him in their midst in his disobedience and obstinacy, or hindering the publication of our said missive. Such men have incurred the punishments set out in that missive, and are to be treated rightfully as heretics and avoided by all faithful Christians, as the apostle says. Basically, the Pope excommunicates him and all his mates and everyone who's helped him. Then it goes political, and Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire, calls an imperial diet, which is like a meeting, basically, the political equivalent to the General Church Council, and gets all the electors together. And basically, again, they religiously, the Pope says, you're done, you're excommunicated. Diet of Worms, as it's properly pronounced, politically sentences him to death, and says, for this reason, we forbid anyone from this time forward to dare, either by words or by deeds, to receive, defend, sustain, or favour the said Martin Luther. Basically outlaws him. And Frederick, the Elector Prince of Saxony, shelters Martin for a period of time. And he survives these things, and his views continue to spread with the help of his political overlord, who never actually meets him. Frederick doesn't actually talk to Martin Luther, but keeps him safe, hides him in a castle for a time, and these ideas spread across Europe. And they spread to France, to England, to Scandinavia, to Eastern Europe, and move throughout and cause massive amounts of unrest. In 1534, for example, Henry VIII breaks from the Catholic Church in order to divorce his wife, and in that way kind of starts the trend that would end up with England being Protestant. And Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, they all go Protestant as well in this period. France, there are civil wars over France should be Catholic or Protestant. So, what is the response from the church to this? Well, first off, Paul III, who is like a hardcore reformer, gets elected as the next pope after this. And in 1545, so this is some years on after this, holds the Council of Trent, a general church council, the first one for centuries. And basically they reassert the doctrine and say, nope, we're definitely sure on these sacraments and this kind of thing. And they try to stamp out the corruption and the nepotism and the practice of, one person holding two bishoprics and gaining the money from both bishoprics, but obviously only being able to be a bishop in charge of one means that they're just not really looking after the other one at all. They stamp that out, that kind of thing. And they make a more standard version of the Bible, and they make the Pope far more powerful and give him far more authority. And that's the thing that I should mention. One of the things Martin Luther does at one point here is he translates the Bible from Latin into German, which is very anti-Catholic teaching because it lets him put in some of his own editorials, which kind of is changing the word of God. But when he says the Bible's really important, Martin Luther says it's very important everyone can read it. And so he translates it into the common tongue so that everyone can read it and understand the Bible for themselves. And so that's, so one of the ways that the Catholics fight back, as it were, is what they do, what's called the Counter-Reformation. So they have the Council of Trent, which is a really good example of that, where they reassert the doctrine, stamp out the corruption. The Jesuits, or also known as the Society of Jesus, appears, and they are like the special forces, black ops, Christians, Catholics, and they are really, really hardcore believers. The picture we have here is Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Society of Jesus. And for example, one of them is sent into Poland, which is about to go Protestant. and is so influential and faithful that he converts Poland back to being Catholic, and Poland is still very, very Catholic. An example of what the Jesuits do. And I've got 1 minute left, so I'm not going to talk anymore about them. And in political response, there are wars fought over this as the Catholic powers try to stop the Protestant powers from gaining authority and gaining position in spreading the Protestant ideals. And the result of Reformation and Counter-Reformation is a kind of stability eventually. So from the map you have here, we can see that England goes Anglican, Scotland becomes Protestant, as does the Netherlands, large parts of Germany, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Baltic states. France, kind of Protestant, kind of Catholic. As I said, civil wars over this. Switzerland is not after Martin Luther, but they have their own reformers and also kind of break from the Catholic Church. But the rest of Europe kind of stays Catholic. So the situation kind of stabilizes eventually. And after the 17th century, countries don't really flip from Protestant to Catholic anymore. It becomes the status quo again. And people's lives are changed by this. I mean, firstly, obviously, if a war is fought over you, then over your land, like in France when there are civil wars, that's obviously a clear material change based on this religious reformation. But also, religion is a really important part of your life. And so when you can read the Bible, when your church services change, that's a big difference. And oh gosh, I've got no time left. So yeah, religion and politics are intertwined. There's definitely a matter of the powerful people want to fight against Rome in northern Germany. And so they break from Rome religiously to give them a political break as well and give them more political independence. That's a quick example. And then finally, Europe is divided between Catholic and Protestant. And that is fed into today. You have the idea of the Protestant work ethic. And Protestant countries are on average much more wealthy than Catholic countries. There has definitely been a split in Europe along the lines of, if we go back a second, Romantic and Germanic Europe, you can see the borders of the Roman Empire along France and in the Alps and down into the Balkans is a thing that's worth pointing out. But then last thing I want to talk about is the rise of German nationalism here. Martin Luther was an anti-Semite, a rabid anti-Semite. He wrote a book called On the Jews and Their Lies, which was featured in the Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer. Tovia Singer, who's a modern day, very influential Orthodox Jewish rabbi, says, among all the church fathers and reformers, there was no mouth more vile, no tongue that uttered more vulgar curses against the children of Israel than this founder of the Reformation. And this view, according to Ronald Berger and Reinhold Lewin, say that he was very influential in the development of German anti-Semitism. There was a direct line from Luther to the Nazis. Heinrich Himmler, even though he was born a Catholic, praised Martin Luther. And if you want to know more about that, you can ask me a question, but I'll conclude here and we can get to some questions. But to conclude, you can see that the Reformation, it split Europe among lines that were, well, I would say predictable, in many ways based along what had been the Roman Empire. But it was shaped by these existing tensions, but it also continued them. And there will be wars fought that were ostensibly over Protestant and Catholic states, like the 30 Years' War, for example, in the 17th century, even though whether or not it's confessional or just power politics is up for debate. And finally, it's worth mentioning that no part of this was inevitable. We can't know for sure that this part would have gone Protestant and this part would have stayed Catholic, as exampled by the fact that Poland nearly went Protestant and then stopped being Protestant afterwards. So I don't want to think that this is some kind of inevitable teleological march of history thing. Rather, this is just the way that it happened based on, in some ways, the influence of certain important people, and in other ways, the pre-existing socioeconomic and material conditions of these parts of Europe. And so I'll conclude there, only 3 minutes over time, and say, and I can see why there might be some questions here. So either over voice or through chat, if you want to ask questions, you can. And I have one question immediately, which is, what is the main difference between Protestant and Lutheran religions? And so that's kind of a vexed question. So Protestant basically is the catch-all term for non-Catholic and not Orthodox either. And there are kind of loads of different kinds of Protestantism. So for example, in England, we have Anglicanism, which is very different to being a Calvinist or being an Episcopalian or being an Anabaptist. So the each are characterized by their own separate belief systems and structures and theories and practices. But Lutheranism, as the main branch of Protestantism, is characterized by things like sola fides, Bible in the vernacular, that kind of thing. Are there any other questions at all? And yeah, if you want me to just like talk a bit more about something, then you can as well. That's cool. Because the stuff I kind of.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
It's John. I've studied this issue quite a lot, actually. And the thing you patently missed out is Calvin, John Calvin. He was equally as big as Luther. And in the end, the Presbyterian Church was at least as big as the Anglican Church. It was an invention of John Calvin. Knox brought it to Scotland. And all Scots are Presbyterians. Even the Catholics are Presbyterians in Scotland. So you've got to give him a tick.
Yes. So yeah, obviously Martin Luther was neither the first, as I said, nor the last big reformer. People like Zwingli and Calvin, who are both Swiss, had massive influence. And Calvinism is one of the biggest branches of Protestantism that exists today, which is, of course, Calvinism influences the religion in Switzerland and also in Scotland. I believe the two main parts, I think Huguenots, the French Protestants, are all that if you are one of the elect, then you will do good things. But it means that you're already going to be going to heaven no matter what, which is a way of explaining free will under God. And there's lots of complicated theology that you can get into, but that's kind of the way that Calvinism is different to other kinds of religions. And yeah, a really big thing that I should have mentioned, honestly, it's just the time here. I have another question, which is, are indulgences still a prominent feature of the Catholic Church, or was this reformed in the same way that holding multiple bishop positions was? To my understanding, indulgences are no longer a thing. They were kind of a bad look, and they made the church look very corrupt. And so instead, I think there's still a feature of, if you do something bad, you still have to do penance for it to, show that you feel really sorry. So you have to say 100 Hail Marys, that kind of thing. But there's no longer the case of pay the church lots and lots of money and your time in purgatory will be reduced. I do believe that was one of the things that was taken away under the Council of Trent. Ask more questions if you want. Otherwise, I'll just talk a bit more about the church in Scotland. That's an interesting thing. But if you have more questions, yeah.
I've got a big question. Are there any parallels between the split of Christianity into Catholicism and Protestantism and the split of Islam into Sunni and Shiite?
So I would say it's kind of backwards, in that the way that the Sunni and Shiite split began wasn't theological, it wasn't religious, it was political, and it was based on who will inherit Muhammad's power once he dies. Do you back Ali or the other guy whose name escapes me, which is annoying. And then it became these two separate groups then formed their own theology over hundreds of years and now are theologically different as well as politically different. Whereas here we have kind of the opposite, where Protestantism starts with Martin Luther saying, I want to be separate from, I have criticisms of the Catholic Church on a theological basis, sola fides, read the Bible, that kind of stuff. And then it becomes this thing where it's a way of the Northern German lords can gain more independence from Rome. And then it becomes political. So in some ways, yes, in that it shares religious disputes and political disputes. But in other ways, I'd say no, because really it's almost backwards. And you have the politics flowing into religion or religion flowing into politics would be my kind of short answer. I'm not an expert on Islamic history. So that's just from my understanding is what I'd say about it.
It's quite interesting to think of the Anglican Church. Speaking as somebody who isn't an Anglican, although I go to an Anglican church, Anglicanism is almost a halfway house between Catholicism and Protestantism. It's definitely a Protestant group. But when Henry VIII took over, all he did was took the Pope out of it and put himself in as the head guy.
Yes, I've heard Henry VIII described as an English Catholic. So
indeed, he kept the Mass, he kept the Latin, he kept the bishop, kept all of these things. What Calvin brought in was no bishops. It's a bottom-up society. It's not a top-down. The Church of England is still very much top-down. most of the other churches are bottom up, and that's the mark of a real Protestant. When you get rid of the politics altogether. So England's sort of halfway house.
Yeah, England is referred to often as a via media, so like a middle road between the Protestants and the Catholics, and that will form the basis of a lot of the religious political disputes that take place in England over the 16th, 17th, even 18th century. There's a lot of that going on, and definitely, I would say that if I were to rank Protestantism in different places, I'd definitely put Anglicanism as the weakest, most Catholic-y kind of Protestantism. And you put, I don't know, like the Wee Frees would be the most hardcore. Yeah.
It's the English genius for compromise. Instead of doing one thing or the other, they go down the middle. So in the Church of England, I worship at a church. I'm at the evangelical wing. The people that I go to church with don't wear any vestments. Round the corner, there's High Anglican, and they're Catholic. They burn incense, they do all the robes, the bells and smells. And that's an English genius for encompassing this huge spectrum is great. To be
a broad church, as it's called. Yeah. So for those who aren't as familiar, one of the like material differences that was the change between Catholicism and Protestantism is that your Catholic priest will wear very brightly colored robes and smells and bells, burn the incense and sing in Latin, that kind of stuff. And when you go Protestant, you will have noticed, possibly even in a lot of churches in England and other Protestant places, that they wear much more severely colored robes. It's just like one of the most basic examples, right? You don't get these big, gloriously colored doom paintings. It's much more severe and much more plain and saying, look, just be religious. That's what they're into.
The other thing you might want to mention is you mentioned the printing press. Without that, who knows what would have happened and how long it would have taken. But in England, they had Tyndale. He was fantastic because he put it into English. And from that, we've got St. James's version, which is 90% Tyndale. And that book went all over the world. You know, the most successful book. When people speak about the Bible being the most published, they really mean the King James Version. And now there are a dozen versions of the English Bible. And it started with guys like Erasmus, Tyndale.
And that in a sense shows the on the one hand why the Protestants didn't want it, well, the Protestants wanted it and why the Catholics didn't want it. Because the Protestants wanted it so that everyone could read it. And that's why you got these different versions and why it's so widely read compared to the Vulgate Bible, which is in pure church Latin. On the other hand, the Catholics say, hang on a second, you've got 10 different versions of the Bible. They all say slightly different things. What's the truth? That would be their criticism of that. And there are some naughty things. For example, there's a bit, I can't remember exactly the passage, but there is a bit in the Latinate Bible which says faith justifies you into heaven. And when Martin Luther translated it into German, he added in a word and said faith alone justifies you into heaven, which is very naughty and probably heresy, depending on who you ask. And that's the danger of these translations, that people can get away with it. On the other hand, of course, it makes it much more widely read. And if that's your goal of society, is to get everyone into being really religious, great, then you would think that might be a good way to do it, is to have the Bible in the vernacular.
But the translation is essential because the Bible that the Roman Catholics were using was by St. Jerome, who translated the Hebrew and Greek into Latin. And that survived for about 1,000 years. But Erasmus, and among others, came along and said, it's a pretty rubbishy, it's not a very good translation.
Yes. Yeah.
And he corrected it. And the best example of that is the word ecclesiastica, which he translated as the congregation, whereas the Catholic Church called it the church. And because they were head of the church, they then controlled it. But Erasmus, by just translating one word, said, it isn't a church as such. It's the people in the church that make the church. It's the congregation. And Protestantism starts with that. The people in the church choose the minister and choose all the way up.
Exactly. I got another question, from the YouTube live chat, which is, you may have mentioned this and I just missed it, but would you say that the split between Catholicism and Orthodoxy and Catholicism and Protestantism was equally bitter? And if not, why not? So the split between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, but incidentally, the terms are going to get very confusing because technically I think everyone claims to be Catholic and Orthodox, and they all kind of just mean like the real church. And so, but what we would call Eastern Orthodoxy, which is the religion followed in Greece and Russia and Eastern Europe, and then Catholicism, which is followed in Rome and Spain, and for example, they had a split that was finalized in the year 400 and something, and I can't remember what it's called, the Great Western Schism. And I would, if I say, was it equally bitter? I would probably say somewhat less bitter, because it was more of a high level. The patriarchs of the Eastern Orthodoxy didn't want to be under the authority of the Pope in Rome, and vice versa, and so they just kind of looked after their own areas, and that's why there were so few. There wasn't much for a long period of time. There wasn't a lot of overlap. Everyone under the authority of the Eastern Orthodoxy people were Orthodox. Everyone under the authority of the Roman Church was Catholic. And so it's much more of like a Western Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire kind of divide. And so, to my understanding, quite a lot less bitter. Although, that could be wrong. But that's from what I gathered. And whereas in this case, it wasn't top break apart. It was a top down separation when the priests and the dukes pulled away from Rome and then caused this whole crisis. Are there any other questions at all?
Is it a gross simplification to say that Henry VIII created to get divorced?
What's it?
I don't think. I think it's almost the opposite. I'd say the other way around. I'd say he barely even broke with Rome. He barely even became a Protestant, and the only reason that he did that, literally was to secure the divorce. Also, I mean, there's a couple other things. So Henry really wanted to dissolve the monasteries because he was quite strapped for cash, and there was a lot of money in the monasteries. And if they were under his authority, he could dissolve them and take all their money, and he did that. So it wasn't just the divorce. There were other reasons why he wanted to break with Rome, but none of them were, I had this big theological, theoretical, doctrinal disputes with them. Like, I just can't handle the fact that they won't let me translate the Bible. It wasn't that at all. It was, I want money, I want a divorce. It was more mundane reasons. So it wasn't as simple as divorce, but that was one of the big reasons. Yeah.
He's the Donald Trump of his day.
That's it. Now that's a bold modern parallel there. I don't know if I'd agree. You know what? Now that you say that, then there may be some resemblances. But he was seen as quite a fine prince of the age in his time.
There were overlaps between the political and the religious, as you mentioned in your.
As always.
If you take the German thing with Martin Luther, Frederick, the electorate, he was suffering the same way as, in a sense, as Henry VIII. The German princes hated the idea that people could come up from Rome for selling indulgences, and there was a net outflow of cash from the German states to build some luxury palaces down in Rome, and they had resented that briefly, and that's why, in a sense, they supported Luther.
And in fact, Frederick of Saxony, I feel obliged to point out, though he was the one who protected Martin Luther and saved him from being executed and stuff, he wasn't Protestant. I think he might have converted on his deathbed, but he lived his entire life as a Catholic person, as a very, very devout Catholic person, in fact. He just wanted to protect the people living under his duchy. So that's... I am conscious of the time, though. So are there any last questions before... we can probably finish up. Are there any other last points? I'm now looking at if anyone's watching on the YouTube chat, I am now looking at that as well. I wasn't for a period of time, and I'm sorry about that. If anyone else has any final questions, then ask away. And otherwise, I would like to thank you all for taking part in this talk. And I think the next one will probably be, as always, in 2 weeks' time, Thursday after next, on the 30 Years' War, I'm fairly certain, and this massive European crisis, or maybe the English Civil War. I'm decided between the two. Answers on a postcard. Email me which one you want, and I'll do that. But I think I'm interested in these religious disputes that play out in terms of politics and possibly even can map onto these romantic Germanic European disputes. So thank you all for watching and for the excellent discussion. And I'll see you all next time.
Thank you very much.
Good. Excellent.